Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm excited to bring you another round of recent horror reads, including my first 5-star horror read of the year. This is always such an exciting feeling. I don't know about you, but I always get so excited to see what is going to be my first new favorite, and I love this book so much. All that being said, I have some other fantastic books to talk about, including some horror manga and some wintry horror reads. So let's get into the books. So first, let's talk about The Terror by Dan Simmons, which is a piece of historical fiction set in the 1800s following an expedition to explore the Northwest Passage. I don't read a lot of historical fiction, but this is one I read with my patron book club, and I'm really glad I read it with them because honestly, it is such a chunky book. I don't know if I would have gotten through it without them. The short synopsis is that they are exploring in this multi-year expedition when things go wrong and they get stuck in the ice and have to spend more time in this expedition than they plan to, and so that leads to shortages of food and they have to survive in the wintry cold. And this is also a piece of survival horror, which is one of my favorite subgenres and one that I do not read enough. And so beyond the physical and realistic horror elements of this book, where they're running out of food, etc., you also have a potential supernatural aspect because there is something out there that is possibly coming for them. This book has fantastic atmosphere. It really just feels cold and you feel so isolated as you hear about their adventures. It again is a very long book and it covers a great span of time and really follows them as things go from bad to worse and the decisions they have to make. And those aspects were really what drew me in. I was very terrified for them. I get very stressed when I read about people not having enough food to eat. It's one of my personal triggers and just very bothersome. And I was intrigued about what was out there, but honestly, the realistic survival elements were the biggest drawing point for me. As I mentioned, this book is crazy long, and I'll be honest that while I enjoyed parts of it, at times it did feel like a slog to read. I did have to push myself through a lot of sections that just weren't personally interesting, or just I didn't care necessarily about some of the side characters. So it is one that if I had not read it with my book club, I might have DNF'd it, but I'm really glad that I pushed myself through and have finished this one. It is really well done. I gave it 3.5 stars, I believe, rounded up, and I just thought it was a very good piece of historical horror. Not, again, a genre I read very often, but if you're interested in reading this one, if you watch the TV show and want to see the actual book that it came from, this is definitely one I would recommend. Not a perfect book for me, just not my personal taste enough to be a 5-star read, but really enjoyable, really suspenseful and cold and isolating, and if that sounds good, definitely check it out for yourself. Next up, I want to talk about Tender is the Flesh, which is a horror dystopian set in a near future where there was a viral outbreak that caused all of the animals to become poisonous to consume. And so in response, people are looking for another way to get their meat products. And so the government allows a special program where people can breed and consume what they call special meat. However, and you find this right on the back of the book, it's not a spoiler whatsoever, it's just a setup, that what this special meat is essentially is other humans. They are breeding them purposely for the intention to eat them. And we as a reader follow one person that works in these factories. It is his job to butcher and prepare the meat for consumption. He is a very interesting character because he is in a way very turned off by this process. He's actually vegetarian himself, but at the same time, he is a cog in the machine. He is doing his job. He is butchering these quote unquote animals for consumption, and you follow him when he gets a gift of a live specimen, which is actually a young woman, and he decides to keep her alive for a while rather than butchering her, and the story follows what happens after that. And this is the book I heard such amazing things about at the end of 2020. This book showed up on everyone's best of the year list who read it. And I am kicking myself that I did not push myself to read it before the year was out, because if I had, it definitely would have ended up on my best books published in 2020 list. But given the state of the year, my personal mental health, I just did not think I was in a place to read a book this dark, because let me say, the tone of this book is dark and depressing. It is not satirical. It is not lighthearted and funny. It is just plain grim. But over the Christmas holidays in early January, I was ready for this book. I was excited for it and picked it up when I was in a really good headspace, because I was again on holidays. And it was exactly what everyone described it would be. It was dark, but it was also so compelling, so well written. The writing is sparse and beautiful, and it's a very short book, which if you follow me, you probably know my preference is for these shorter books. I do like a book that is not overly bloated, that really gets in, tells the story in a tight, concise way, and gets out. And I just loved every aspect of this book. If you can't tell, this is my first 5-star horror read of the year, and my goodness, it was a good one. So if you're thinking about picking this one up, I do recommend it. For me, what I love so much is that it was so unique. It's very different than a lot of the other horror books you're going to read. It's scary in a way because it feels possible. And I also want to mention that this book obviously deals with a lot of commentary on meat production. And I myself am a meat eater. I am not vegetarian, I am not vegan, and this book definitely made me think about my practices. But even if you are a meat lover yourself and aren't willing to give up your bacon, because quite frankly, I did not change my own consumption habits based off this book. But regardless, I do think that this book can be appreciated by any reader. It will certainly make you a bit turned off of eating meat while you're reading it. I remember I had to ground some beef for a chili in the morning while I was reading this book, and I realized what a bad idea that was. So it's definitely a very visceral book. It's a book that is going to turn your stomach. It has tons of content warnings. I don't want to spoil the book, but if you have concerns, comment down below and I will specifically tell you what is in this book. But it deals with some very topical issues in a very nuanced way. I would love to read more by this author. It is a translated work, so I am crossing my fingers that more books by her get translated. I will read anything else she writes, and just cannot recommend this book enough. Again, this is the 2020 release that really got away from me, and I'm so glad that I did not hold off any longer picking it up. And yeah, I just cannot stop thinking about it. Definitely a huge new favorite of mine, not just of the year, but I could see it being an all-time favorite, and that's a pretty big thing for me to say. Next up, we have Romina by Junji Ito, which is a horror manga novel that I recently got to read, and I'm so happy to review for you all. It's a brand new release, and this is set in a near future where there's a scientist who discovers a wormhole, and through that wormhole, a planet comes, and he names the planet Remina after his own daughter. Now, this planet starts to come for Earth, which causes a huge panic because there is the question of if this is going to be dangerous, if it is going to come for them in some sinister way. And because of this, the people of Earth turn on the scientist's daughter, Remina, and believe that in order to stop the planet from coming for them, they need to sacrifice her. Now, I think that this is a very topical story in the way that you do see this storyline played out throughout history, where people, specifically women, are often blamed for natural disasters and so forth. And so it's a very familiar storyline. And in terms of the story itself, I did find it to be a little bit weak, or rather simplistic. Most of the story involves Romina and her small group of friends running away from this ginormous crowd that is chasing after her. There is so much hysteria and craziness around this story, and it's definitely a weird one. In a way, I could describe this as space horror, but really it's more cosmic horror, because the planet itself, you realize, is alive. It has an eyeball. It is watching them. It is coming for them. This is not a natural event by any means. And so you get these cosmic horror elements coming in, which isn't always my favorite genre, but here it is done very well. And what I love so much about the story, no surprise, is the artwork. It was so eerie and creepy and disturbing. And the artwork itself was 5 stars. Just loved it. I could just spend time looking at these pictures. They are so beautiful. But because the story itself was a bit simple for my personal preferences, it just wasn't as scary as I wanted it to be. Not that books have to be scary in order to be good, but what I usually like so much about Junji Ito is his psychological horror. And in this case, unfortunately, this leaned more into the action side of horror, where it's more again about being chased and running away and people coming for her. And I just didn't find that as scary as the plot that I hoped that this would have. I wanted it to kind of just make me feel unsettled and uneasy, which is normally what I get from Junji Ito. So all that being said, if you are a fan of Junji Ito, absolutely go read this. At least for the artwork, it is so worth it. If you are new to Junji Ito, I probably wouldn't recommend starting with this one because I don't think it's his strongest, but still a solid 4-star read for me. I really enjoyed it and I'm so thankful that I got a chance to read it as soon as I did. Finally, I want to end out the video by recommending a short story collection called Anoka by Shane Hawkes. This is a piece of Indigenous horror, and I received a digital and audiobook copy from the author for review, and I'm really thankful for that because I saw this book going around online, and given my preference for Indigenous stories to begin with, especially when they're horror, this one sounded right up my alley. And as I mentioned, I don't review a lot of short stories on my channel anymore, so when I do, pay attention because it usually means that it's really good, and this is definitely the case here. This is a very short collection, and the stories, as always, some grabbed me more than others, but for the most part, I did like them. There were 3 stories that really stood out for me. One dealt with young parents of a newborn, another one dealt with parents of an older child, and definitely had some creepy kid vibes, and then the last story was a really good play on the werewolf mythology and was set around Halloween and was just very unique and just kind of played into some of the mythos around the creatures of Indigenous culture like the Wendigo. So definitely recommend the collection if you're interested in which were my favorite stories. You can always go check out my Goodreads review. The audiobook version was well done. I thought the narrator gave a very even performance, and so if you do the audiobook or the ebook, I do think you're going to be really happy with what you get. And I of course love the fact that it brought in little pieces of Indigenous life and commentary on what it is like to be a Native American, of course in an own voices way. And I would love to see more by this author. I'd love to see some longer fiction, since I do prefer novellas and novels over short stories, but definitely worth your time. If you love short stories, you should go read this right now. Even if you don't always like short stories, I would still recommend giving this one a try because again, it really grabbed my attention and made for a just short and sweet read that was just, yeah, very well done and definitely left me thinking about at least a few of the stories. So that's it down below. Let me know which of the books you are planning on picking up that I talked about, and let me know if you have gotten your first 5-star read of 2021. I would love to hear what it is because again, for me, I think it's so exciting when you find that first new favorite and just get to start out the year fresh and start making a new list for the end of the year. Otherwise, if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror as well as some thrillers, science fiction, and fantasy. You can help me out by sharing this video around online, hitting that notification bell, and giving this video a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.